Welcome to a Satluj TV news special. Justin Trudeau's accusation last week against the Indian government over their alleged involvement in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil has unsurprisingly had a massive impact across both the West and domestically in India. If true, the implications are both enormous and deeply concerning. So to explore the impact of this in more detail, we're joined today by a regular guest here on the Satluj Network, former US Congressman Trent Franks. Congressman Franks, welcome and thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me.
So, Congressman, simple question. Do you believe Justin Trudeau?
Well, you know, Angus, I have to, if I'm completely honest, I have to suggest to you that I believe that Justin Trudeau is a left-wing, woke, socialist demagogue. But as they say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I definitely believe he is on the right track. I believe he's doing the right thing. And coming from someone who holds that opinion that I just articulated, that should give the world an opportunity to really look at this. Because if indeed Hardeep Singh Nijjar was murdered by his own government on foreign soil, on the sovereign territory of Canada, this is of a profound significance. And if the evidence is there, if it's a proven situation, they should run this to ground and hold the Indian government accountable. It's a very, very serious thing.
Well, that's a good question. So if we look at it from, let's say, a high-level perspective, if indeed Trudeau does provide the proof, as has been requested by India, does this start, I mean, already we have a pretty serious diplomatic spat, but does it start a diplomatic war, or does it even indeed cause something even more serious than that?
Well, the truth is, if indeed this man was murdered by his own government on Canadian soil, it's worth a diplomatic spat. It's worth us being able to stand before the world and say, this is not going to be business as usual. Our foreign relations right now are subordinate to getting to the bottom of this situation, because we have to, as a sovereign nation ourselves, be concerned that we might be protecting ourselves from the same kind of a problem. Again, now everything should be based on the evidence, and I think that seems to be where the Trudeau government is going, is that they're looking at this and run it to ground. But I'll tell you that this is something of such significance that it should subordinate any of our concerns about foreign relations or somehow our diplomatic ability to talk nice to each other. We should be very direct with each other on this kind of a subject.
So I mean, there is an assumption then that the evidence will support the accusation. And if that does come to pass, do you think, I mean, this is all very much from the Canadian perspective, but from a US perspective, do you think the US would stand with Canada, and would it be drawn further into this spat with India? And if so, to what degree do you think the US would be prepared to get involved?
Well, first of all, I believe, as you've just articulated, if this is proven to be true, the American government would be irresponsible not to be drawn into this kind of a discussion, because this goes to the very core of American ideals. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're all created equal, and that is certainly something that encompasses religious freedom. And to stand by and let another nation on a predetermined, calculated basis murder another human being on sovereign soil of another country, predicated on their political differences or their religious freedom differences, is of the gravest concern. And we have to be willing, as a country, as the nation that is ostensibly the flagship of freedom in the world, to stand up and say, no, this is not acceptable. And if that means being drawn into it and having a public disagreement with a country that we want to succeed, then we should do that.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there is this assumption that the evidence will be there to support the accusation, but you've articulated very clearly earlier on your opinion of Justin Trudeau, and it's widely known that he is not a popular Prime Minister. And India have leveraged that fact, and they even claim that he is being unduly influenced by another Canadian party, the NDP, the New Democratic Party, who itself represents up to 750,000 Sikhs based in Canada. That's nearly 2% of the Canadian population. So the accusation from the Indian media, which has been very widespread, is that the NDP are propping up Justin Trudeau in power, and therefore it's likely that they believe he is just pandering to their demands. Do you think that is likely?
Well, I've already said what my perspective is on Mr. Trudeau, and I think he certainly is gifted at pandering. But the bottom line here is the issue itself. If he is standing by and letting something happen on his own soil, where a person that lives in his country and is abiding by the laws of Canada is murdered by a sovereign government in another country, and he doesn't do something about it, then it's a far worse thing. And he should do what's right here, and he should run this to ground regardless of any accusations of political pandering or regardless of any political pressures within his country. Whatever it takes to get to the truth should be his commitment. And if he does that, it will be, in my judgment, a breath of fresh air coming from the Trudeau government.
If we look at it, let's say, from the Indian government's perspective, now they in recent years have made at least a dozen requests of the Canadian government to extradite individuals that the Indian government have labelled as terrorists, Hardeep Singh Nijjar being one of those individuals. Now, of course, Indian media has been working overtime in claiming Canada is a haven for terrorists. That's quite a big call of a Western democracy. Of those 12 or so requests over recent years, every single one has actually been turned down by the Canadian government. So do you think India actually then does have a genuine grievance?
Well, I think you first have to ask yourself, why have those 12 extradition requests been turned down? You know, India is always been willing to throw around labels of terrorism on people that because of the political differences that are really less terrorism and more political differences than anything else. And the idea that we should extradite people who are genuinely guilty of a crime that would be a crime in both countries, that's one thing, as long as it's done in an open and an orderly manner where the world can see that it's not politically driven. But when India, as has been known in the past, is willing sometimes to casually throw the label terrorist around, then we should be asking ourselves, why have these requests been turned down? And I think that to extradite someone based on another country's political differences is a failure of holding up to the values of your own country. So I would look askance at this in a huge way.
Yes, I think that's a very fundamental point. We have actually seen a pattern of campaigners, political campaigners, being labelled as terrorists by the Indian government, which has raised obviously a lot of concern. And particularly that concern has been raised by the Sikh community, the Sikh diaspora in Canada, the US and in the UK. And that community has warned the authorities that they are being labelled as terrorists, and as a result they are concerned for their own safety. And they've actually raised concerns about India's actual intentions to assassinate several key Khalistani campaigners. And that is a fact supported by the intelligence agencies of each country, each respective country. Now, Trudeau's government has actually been criticised for not taking those warnings seriously, even from their own intelligence agencies. Now, from your perspective, Congressman, in the US there are up to 300,000 Sikhs living on US soil. Can that community rely on the Biden administration to protect them on their home soil?
Well, Angus, you are certainly asking the difficult questions. You know, as you might imagine, I hold Mr. Biden and Mr. Trudeau to be within the brotherhood of woke socialist demagogues, as I mentioned earlier. But I would say this much. If the Sikh people are able to make their case, and I think they are, you know, I want to make it very clear what my own opinion is. I believe the Sikh people have earned and deserve their autonomy and independence. I make no bones about that in any way. But the truth is, if this situation has occurred and is in danger of occurring in the United States, if that should ever happen here, regardless of the incompetence or the lackadaisical nature of the Biden administration, I believe that the response would be so visceral among our people and so intense among the people like me and others that look to these kinds of issues, religious freedom issues, that this would create an overwhelming response on the part of the United States. I think even the Biden administration would have to respond. So I would hope that the answer to your question would be yes, but I would just suggest to you that that's primarily grounded on the notion that the American people would respond in the way that I think they would.
Yeah, and if we drill down that point just a little bit further, I mean, there are widespread allegations, accusations that the Indian Intelligence Service, the NIA, the National Investigation Agency, have been operating on UK soil, on Canadian soil, and indeed on US soil. So do you think it is likely that US agencies, and by that I refer to obviously the CIA, the FBI, do you think they will be monitoring them? And if they do indeed uncover activities, what practical action do you think they will take?
Well, the first thing, I would hope that this conversation you and I are having and that the profile of this issue would be a wake-up call to the CIA and to the FBI in the United States to be very vigilant in these areas. And when they do find any sort of evidence that this is taking place, it should be of the highest profile in the United States. We should be talking about it, because one of the ways to deter this kind of evil activity is to make sure that the world knows about it, because the world doesn't accept the idea of killing your political dissidents or your religious dissidents in other countries. They don't buy that. They don't buy it in doing it in your own country, much less going to another sovereign nation and doing it. So I am convinced that that this conversation could have an effect on our own critical agencies, so that they'll pay attention, and just that they know that we're all watching them, and we want them to uphold their oath of office and to do the thing that they've promised to do, and to do that without all of the political nonsense or any pressure from the Biden administration, just to do what's right. And if they do that, then everyone, including the Sikh people, I believe, will be served well.
Mm. If I may indulge maybe a little speculation here, if I move a little bit closer to our home here in the UK, another high-profile campaigner, Avtar Singh Kandar, died under very suspicious circumstances around the same time as Hardeep Singh Nijjar. In the light of Justin Trudeau's accusations, do you think it's possible that he too was murdered?
Well, I believe that at the very least, it deserves intense scrutiny because of India's past record. India claims to be a nation of religious freedom, and we all want that to be true. I want it to be true, but I will tell you that I have observed in the past, many times when I interacted with Indian leadership when I was in government. I traveled to India, I was on the India caucus. This is something that I looked at carefully, and I saw many times where there were vestiges of the Hindu caste system that were still lingering within the government there, and it really was a great concern to me. So when you have a background like that, and you have evidence as we find in Canada, then it should invite special scrutiny, and I think that we should look at it very carefully and make sure what the situation there is. And I have to tell you that it wouldn't shock me if we found something there of culpability on the part of the Indian government.
Okay, Congressman, if we can, I'd like to just funnel this down into really what is the core concept of what all these issues are based around. And that central issue is basically one of self-determination. Now, Sikhs in and from the Punjab have demanded their right to self-determination within an independent state that they would like to call Khalistan. Congressman, do you agree with this basic right of self-determination?
I do. I believe that the Sikh people have had many promises broken. I believe they've been betrayed in the past on many fronts. And so oftentimes, what's so ironic about this thing, Angus, is that the Sikh people oftentimes were just pursuing religious freedom within Punjab, within their own nation. And because they were oppressed and pushed down, that's now come to be a drive for complete independence. Now, I've already suggested to you that I personally support the Sikh people's right to autonomy and to independence. But the bottom line is, the way the Indian government has pursued this, I believe has turned it into a much more intense issue than it would have been had they simply done what was right and recognized the religious freedom within their own country and recognized the ability of people to have pluralism and to even agree to disagree. But when you come in and tell the Sikh people, we will put our leaders as puppets within your religious organization, whether it's the SGPC or whatever it might be, when a government tells people that, it is an invitation to rebellion. And I think that that's true all over the place. If we want unity as a people in any nation, we don't begin by oppressing our people. We don't begin by taking away their basic freedoms. We do this by saying, okay, our unity here is that we are all created equal. We are all have the right to live and be free and pursue our dreams. That's the very foundation of America. And I have to suggest to you that I believe it so deeply in my heart that I openly advocate it for other nations. And I think in this case it would work as well. And I just hope that we don't lose sight of the only way to unity is to respect everyone's basic rights to live and be free and pursue their dreams. And that includes religious freedom. That includes some self-determination in their lives so that they do not have to bow down to their government, but rather than that their government gains its ascendancy by the consent of the governed, as we talk about here in America.
Indeed, and I think a prime example of that self-determination within a democracy is here in the United Kingdom, where Scotland was given the right to self-determine whether Scotland wanted to go independent in 2014. It was a huge referendum. It threatened to break up the United Kingdom, which was a massive deal. Yet they were given that democratic right to vote if they wanted to go independent. Unfortunately for the United Kingdom, they voted to stay within the Union. But of course, self-determination is that fundamental right within a democracy. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you here, Angus, but I would just suggest to you that that shows a great deal of wisdom on the part of the UK leadership, because if, say, England had simply said, no, you're going to do what we say and you're going to be part of us no matter what, if they had been heavy-handed, then perhaps the referendum would have gone a different direction. And I guess that's what I'm really saying here now, is that if you want unity in a nation, you have to respect the basic rights of your people. And that has not happened with the Sikh people. They deserve to have their story told to the world, and I believe when their story is told, that the world will begin to move in their direction in dramatic ways. And I say that obviously as someone who is a prime example, Exhibit A. But the bottom line is, you cannot maintain unity by force. You have to do it by common held convictions and principles.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair reflection of what happened in Scotland. I think there is a direct correlation where the democratic government, the more they resisted the ability of the Scottish people to speak, the more the move towards Scottish independence grew. And we're seeing that exactly the same in Khalistan. And it's arguable that India has mishandled this whole issue probably since 1947, which is why it remains an open wound within India that still remains unresolved and probably will remain unresolved until they are given that voice.
Well, I would agree with that completely. I would agree with everything that you just said.
So, Congressman, if we continue that point and we talk about giving them a voice, an unofficial referendum is being held across the diaspora as we speak to assess that support for an independent state of Khalistan. So if the outcome of that referendum is unambiguously in favour of an independent state, do you believe the US would firstly support the concept of an independent state, secondly then pressure India into holding an official referendum to ratify that vote, and finally, should that referendum succeed, then support the establishment of that state?
I believe that would be the general response of the American people. I can't speak to the Biden administration because, as you know, I find myself pretty much dumbfounded at some of the positions that they take on a regular basis, especially when it comes to religious freedom and the whole woke nonsense that is sweeping the world. But I would suggest to you that the American people, I think, would be supportive of that. And I think the Indian government would be very wise to begin to extend the hand of friendship and peace to all of their people, including the Sikh people, and that would include giving them the right to have their own referendum. And to do otherwise at this point, when they've been so heavy-handed in the past, as you say, is, in my judgment, to invite further conflict going forward.
And indeed, the Indian government, to exacerbate the issue, they've made any discussion of secessionism in any form effectively illegal. Now, from Narendra Modi's perspective, the motive is understandable. He is trying to unite a huge and diverse nation. But we come back to that same fundamental point. Is it democratic to make talk of secessionism illegal?
Well, you know, it's kind of ironic because here in the United States, it's perfectly legal to talk about states seceding from the United States Union. It's perfectly legal for us to do that. We don't do that because we recognize that we're better together than we are apart most of the time. And for some of us, I suppose, might think that it wouldn't be such a bad idea for a few left-wing states to secede from the Union. And of course, I'm joking a little bit, but the point is that you hold the Union together by unified principles, by principles that recognize the rights of every single child of God. That's how you hold the Union together. If you try to hold it together by force or completely undemocratic or just tyranny or totalitarian perspective, it will eventually fail. There is something in the human heart that yearns for freedom. And what you have to have then, in my judgment, is a unity based on freedom. And if we continue to hold to that, I believe there's a chance that the whole world will somehow come together as a human family and recognize that we all deserve to be free and to have the chance to lay hold on the miracle of life and to go about pursuing our dreams. It is a miracle beyond understanding, this thing called life, and if we ignore those basic human yearnings of the heart for freedom, we inevitably set up a conflict among ourselves.
Of course, and of course, freedom comes in practical terms, in terms of democracy, it comes in elections. And if I can look at one specific example of this, you yourself, Congressman, were the former chairman of the Religious Freedom Caucus in the US government. And you're probably aware of the SGPC, you've referred to it earlier in the interview. That's a central organisation representing Sikhs across the Punjab region. Now, the SGPC by law is supposed to have elections every 5 years, but none have actually been held for 12 years, and this is due to legal obstacles thrown into the process, primarily from central government.
Well,
is that indicative? Sorry, Congressman, I'll just wrap this question up if I may. Do you think that Sikhs, and this is indicative of this symptom, do you think Sikhs are being treated as second-class citizens in India? And does it appear to you that Indian democracy, and I use the term democracy in quotation marks deliberately there, it only seems to apply to the religious majority?
Well, I think this is a perfect example that your point is absolutely correct. The SGPC, as I understand it, even though they have government charter, is a religious organization. It's a religious union. And when the government of India comes in and puts their puppets in these positions and essentially dictates what the leadership of a religious order would be, that is the definition of oppressing religious freedom. I don't know how you could say it any more strongly. So I think that this is a perfect example of what is causing so much difficulty between the different peoples of the Union, the different peoples there of India. And I am convinced with all of my heart that this is the kind of thing that will lead to the exact opposite of what the Indian government would like to achieve. If we can't give people religious freedom, then all other freedoms are gone as well. With religious freedom, all other freedoms eventually follow. But religious freedom is the most basic platform of all freedom. And when we start crossing that line, we set ourselves up for enormous conflict going forward, in my opinion.
We've looked at a lot of specifics about these issues. I'd like to, if I may, take a few big steps backwards and let's look at the bigger picture, the geopolitical situation that this whole issue does unfold. If Canada's accusation against India is proven to be true, do you think the right move is to isolate India? And if so, what do you think that would mean for the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, regardless of the comments I've made here, some of them rather critical, I truly believe that it's in the best interest of America and India to be on as friendly basis as possible. And so I don't think isolating the country is the answer. My main concern has not been the Indian people. My main concern has been, under the current administration, some of these policies that I think are not only undemocratic, but that are antithetical to religious freedom. And I believe that the danger that Russia and China, North Korea, countries that have no commitment to human rights, is a great danger to the entire human family in the world. And so I believe it's important that we find the common ground that we can and come together and defeat these terrible enemies of freedom. And I'm convinced that China is the greatest threat to human freedom that perhaps the world has ever known. And we better get our act together soon, or that could become an eventuality, and it just can't happen. And we must all, as nations that even aspire to hold to the ideal of human freedom, we have to come together and defeat those ideologies and those, in this case, those nations that have been essentially co-opted their people to force their idea of the totalitarian perspective they have down everyone's throat.
Yeah, it's a very important point because last week military chiefs of staff from 30 countries, including the US and of course the UK, met in India to discuss the stability in that region. And Beijing themselves have warned very unambiguously and very clearly that any NATO-like military alliance in Asia-Pacific would provoke conflict. Now, India itself has very historic ties with Russia, that even refused to join in the condemnation of their invasion of Ukraine. But it also has a very abrasive relationship with China itself. They, of course, do share a border, and there have been skirmishes of various sizes along that border. So it's a very complex network, it's a very complex web of dynamics there. From the Western perspective, in those dynamics, can we see India as an ally to the West or not?
Well, I think we have to try, Angus. I believe that because, and India should understand one thing. If there's something that I could say that I would hope that the Indian government would listen to or would consider, would be, first of all, make sure your own home is taken care of. And by that, I mean make sure your own people's rights to religious freedom and their basic rights to freedom of expression is protected. To do otherwise is to sow seeds of your own disintegration at some point. But secondly, India must realize that any advantage that Russia or China might offer them economically or otherwise, in the long run will turn into the greater disadvantage of the most profound and grave concern to India. You cannot trust countries like China under the CCP to ever be committed to anything but their own ends, which is world domination. And as Solzhenitsyn mentioned, you know, India should consider his words that China is bent on world domination, and if we are not very careful, they might achieve that end, and that would be a dark future for our children and our children's children. So I hope that India would be very cautious in the alliances that they make and realize that America seeks not to somehow subordinate India. We love the Indian people, and we want India to be a free and noble nation. We want them to be committed to their own people's freedom. And the only thing that prevents that sometimes is when they take tacks where they ignore these basic freedoms, and that makes it incompatible with the American ideal.
Indeed. And if we fast forward to some point in the future, and of course China and India both growing future superpowers, India itself is the most populous nation on earth, and it is definitely going to be a future superpower. So, God forbid if one day India itself does end up in conflict with China, at whatever scale, even on a relatively small scale, where do you think the US and, of course, by extension, NATO would sit in a potential conflict there?
Well, Angus, I would hope for very deep and committed reasons that the United States would have the good sense to stand with India against China in almost any circumstance. I can't imagine one that wouldn't apply to. I mean, as I've said, I truly believe that China is the most dangerous totalitarian threat in the world today. And we must all stand against that if we know what's good for us. And so I would hope that the American government would be unambiguous. And so, of course, so would NATO. I would hope that, and I would believe that to be true. I especially believe if a Donald Trump should regain the presidency, that would absolutely be true. But the future is unknown to us. But if we know what's good for us as a people in both India, certainly it'd be great if China had the opportunity to vote in a fair way. But if we know what's good for us in any country where we have the opportunity to choose our leaders, we better choose very wisely, because the stakes are of the most profound nature today, maybe more than they've ever been.
Well, let me pick up on that very point and ask you, Congressman. It's 2024. President Trump has won the US election. How do you think he would handle, firstly, India and, of course, secondly, China?
Well, I'm not sure if Donald Trump would agree with everything I've said here today. But what I am deeply convinced of is that a Donald Trump presidency, or under a Donald Trump presidency, the freedom of people throughout the world would be in far safer position than they are under a Biden presidency. I served 6 years at the same time Joe Biden was serving in the Senate. I was in the House just across the way. And I've never seen this man do anything but be true to his own political expediency. Principles be damned. The innocent are not considered. And I would suggest to you, if the world is putting our faith in his noble or principled leadership, we will be part of a very cautionary tale going forward. So I can't know what Donald Trump would do, but I am convinced if the world looks at it objectively, that the world would be a far safer place with a President Donald Trump than they are with a President Joseph Biden.
Let's hope they are prescient words. Congressman Franks, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Angus. It's always a pleasure, my friend.
You've been watching a Satluj TV News special. I'm Angus Scott in London. We'll see you next time.
Go where no one has gone before. Between the sounds of bombs and the whisperings, echoes of truth. Confronting power with courage and lighting the darkest shadows to inform and inspire. Flowing with truth and charting our own path. Satluj Network. Let the truth flow.